So I'd like to talk for a minute before I get into the game plan section of the course about how to make the most of this information if you are not a Heads Up No Limit player. So I'm sure a lot of you are regular ring game players or tournament players, and I want to talk a little bit about how you can adapt the format that I'm going to provide for game planning to suit your specific game more effectively. So the main difference between the type of work that I'm doing in Heads Up No Limit and what you can accomplish in those other formats is that the level of detail that you can achieve over a short period of time is going to be harder as you add more branches to what you need to study. So, for example, in Six-Handed Cash, what you're looking at on screen right now is the Poker Scientist filters for viewing post-flop sims. In 100 Big Blind Cash, you have 4 different opening positions for in position versus big blind, potentially. You have blind versus blind tree that needs to be studied. You have 3-bet pots, both in position and out of position. You have 4-bet pots, both in position and out of position. So there's a lot more pre-flop variation in what needs to be studied compared to Heads Up, where you're literally just looking at button versus big blind and deciding if you're studying single raise pots, 3-bet pots, or 4-bet pots. So the format that I provide for game planning gets into a lot of detail in single raise pots, gets into a lot of detail in 3-bet pots. And that's because we have the luxury of knowing exactly what positions we're playing always. So what can you do to try to achieve this level of game planning in a more complicated game? So a few recommendations I would make. One is starting with the absolutely most important situations and working your way out from there. So if I was going to walk through this process in 100 Big Blind Cash games right now, I would certainly recommend one of a few situations. I would recommend button versus big blind single raise pot. So this is going to be one of, if not the most common scenario in the game tree. And if you haven't game planned for button versus big blind single raise pot, then you're missing one of the highest value situations that you play in 6max cash. Another situation, just going off of frequency, right, would be all the blind versus blind scenarios. So if you're playing in a game where the rake is low enough to limp, then looking at blind versus blind limped pots, looking at blind versus blind 3-bet pots, these are some of the most common confrontations, and they're going to function differently than a lot of other spots, which kind of brings me to my next point, which is combining similar situations as often as possible. Would I recommend going from button versus big blind into cutoff versus big blind? Absolutely not. Cutoff versus big blind is going to play far too similarly to button versus big blind to get you any value out of studying cutoff in as much detail as you studied button. Once I felt confident with button versus big blind, I would study under the gun versus big blind. I would look for the biggest possible differences in pre-flop ranges so that you can see the most extreme variation in strategy. And what you'll find is that a lot of spots actually play kind of similar between under the gun and button. And when you run across those situations, you realize, oh, I never needed to study that in cutoff or MP either, because it's just a function of playing in position versus the big blind. So any similarities you pick up between under the gun big blind and button big blind are situations that you no longer need to study because you've already game planned for them when you did button big blind. So I would carry that logic with me to almost every situation. I would start with the most frequent. So let's think about 3-bet pots. What's the most frequent 3-bet pot you're going to play? Other than maybe blind versus blind, it's going to be button small blind. So button small blind, or potentially something like cutoff button. But these are going to be different. So you're going to want to categorize these differently, right? So you're going to have in position 3-bet pots and out of position 3-bet pots. In this case, out of position 3-bet pots And I don't mean like studying from the perspective of out of position. I just mean playing a 3-bet pot where the out of position player was the one who 3-bet. So this is going to be its own category of spot. And I would start with the most common, so button small blind, get really good at the most common situation. And then I would look at one of the most uncommon situations. So maybe something like MP big blind or under the gun big blind. And any similarities, again, that we find between those two, we can now assume that these are fixed out of position 3-bet pot strategies that we don't need to research the differences when it's cutoff versus big blind or MP versus small blind or what have you. Because if they carried over from the loosest situation to the tightest situation, then we know it's more just a function, or we're pretty confident that it's more just a function of positional 3-bet pot strategy. We can do the same thing for in position. We would start with cutoff button, and then we would later look at under the gun MP. So we've got the tightest possible range and the loosest possible range. And you're going to see differences. You're going to start taking notes. And I like to think in these terms when I play 6-handed or when I play 8-handed, thinking in terms not of the exact positions, but tight range 3-bet pot, loose range 3-bet pot, tight range single raise pot, loose range single raise pot. If we think in these broad terms, we can find more reliable patterns that carry over to more situations, and we can make a more qualitative game plan that's still going to get us 80-90% of the way there in terms of theoretical accuracy. So those are my kind of two most important things to keep in mind for adjusting this strategy to 6-max. Again, one is starting with the most frequent situations and working out from there. And second is combining similar situations into the same game plan. So not studying cutoff and button separately, but just assuming late position is going to work the same, assuming early position is going to work the same, and giving yourself less detail to work through. There's some post-flop recommendations that I'll get to in a second, but I just want to touch on tournaments as well while I'm here. Because in tournaments, there's the added layer of stack size. So just continuing the same train of thought, what are the most frequent situations we want to study? What are the situations we can combine so that we don't need to learn them separately? The extra variable of stack size means we need to make those same decisions for stack size. So here on Poker Scientist, you've got 10, 15, 20, 25, 30, 40, and 75. As a tournament player, you could decide, it's just true that the deeper stack situations are not as important to your bottom line. You could late register and completely avoid deep stack, but even if you are playing deep stack, the amount of money you're playing for at the early stages of the tournament is relatively small compared to your bankroll. So it's not that important to put a lot of study time into those stack sizes. You're going to want to spend most of your study time in like the 20 to 30 big blind range, also shallower. You're going to want to put most of your study time into models that have some sort of ICM considered, ideally, but it's not essential. You can always just make intuitive adjustments towards ICM models based on what you've seen in your baseline chip EV models. And this is kind of what I recommend just in general with this type of study is coming up with whatever your baseline is, getting really good at that baseline, and then learning how different factors move you away from that baseline, rather than trying to learn a different stack size or a different stage of the tournament as if it's a completely new game. So maybe your baseline is going to be 20 big blinds chip EV. Very common situation. Lots of relevance to online play. If you do a lot of late registering, you're probably going to be joining a ton of tournaments in the 15 to 20 big blind range. Same with live tournaments if you're late registering, although live certainly plays a substantial amount more of deep stack play than online. And within 20 big blind play, you might want to think, what are the most important situations to study at 20 big blinds? Well, at 20 big blinds, I might never get to the under the gun versus cutoff or under the gun versus hijack single raise pot. I mean, yeah, those ranges exist. Yes, they can be solved. But how often have you played a 20 big blind single raise pot under the gun versus cutoff or under the gun versus hijack? You've probably played one in the last 3 months. So completely ignore this, right? You don't need to study that in bulk. Those are the types of situations you study in one-off simulations. What you do need in 20 big blind play is a whole lot of late position single raise pots and pretty much everything versus the big blind. So any variation of I opened and the big blind called is going to be a high frequency situation for you. And same thing as cash. You can combine similar positions. You could just do an early position strategy, probably using under the gun range. You could do a late position strategy using button or cutoff, and maybe you could get to a middle position. But honestly, I would just start with the biggest variation. And blind versus blind play is going to be really important at 20 bigs. You're going to play a lot of blind versus blind post flop. And we're just talking about post flop here, of course. Pre-flop is a whole nother thing to study. You can check out the Pre-flop Academy video if you want to see how I would do work on studying MTTs. Pre-flop, but the main thing post-flop is figuring out what are the scenarios that are going to come up over and over again that I actually need to be proficient at, and I need to come up with a game plan for. Anything shallower than 20, I would shy away from game planning, again, because there's going to be a lot of variation in pre-flop ranges. There's going to be fewer post-flop spots with consistency, fewer like single raised or 3-bet. You're definitely not going to be playing 3-bet pots. So you want to be realistic about what scenarios are actually coming up. I could even see using 25 big blind, depending on what site you play on and what structures you play as your baseline, but something shallow where ranges are pretty consistent and you do see a lot of flops. So I'm thinking 20 to 25 big blinds there. And then the next most important thing is like slightly deeper stack play where 3-bets start to become relevant. So maybe that's 40 big blinds for you. You could look at 75 big blinds as a comparison here. 40 seems fine, although maybe my preference would be 50 if we had it, 50 or 60. And the reason we want to study that is so that we can look at some frequent 3-bet pots and some single raise pot strategy that is at a stack depth where 3-bets are like a significant part of the pre-flop range, a significant part of the pre-flop strategy. And that's going to start to look a lot more like ring cash, where you're going to want to look at button versus small blind 3-bet pots or hijack versus button 3-bet pots, right? And again, we're just trying to come up with like 2 or 3 standard situations to represent all the possible situations we might encounter here. In tournaments especially, I find that being flexible in your strategy is a lot more valuable than it is in ring cash or especially in heads up, because there's no way that you or your opponents could have game planned for all the detailed nodes in all the positional variations with all the stack size variations. So don't set that as an expectation for yourself. You want to learn a few of these spots really well, and you want to learn the mechanics for how those spots change depending on the variables, right? So as we get deeper, what happens? As we get very shallow, what happens? As the ranges get tight, what happens? As we get later in the tournament, what happens? When we learn these kind of general truths, then we can adapt that game plan that we made in the first place. But game planning for all of the spots is unrealistic, and I don't want you to try and think that that's the project that I'm suggesting you take on. So in the upcoming section, I'm going to walk through how I game planned for Heads Up No Limit. And again, that will go into a fair bit of detail in certain nodes, but it's meant to introduce you to the style of learning that I think is appropriate for different types of spots. So for flop situations in and out of position, for turn situations in and out of position, for turn situations that depend on previous bets, or river situations that depend on previous bets. The reason I show you all those different nodes is not because I think it's expected to have a strong game plan at every single node in the game. It's so that you can see how to study a different spot depending on what got you there, or depending on what street we're on or what position we're in. And that way you can decide what's important for you to game plan, and you can build a pretty good strategy that you can rely on when you're actually playing these spots in game.